The Dumases believe that invading a level 7 world should be easy. Level 7, as in level 1, is basic survival as any creature would be. Level 2 is fire and basic tools. Level 3 is metal and metallurgy. Level 5 is machinery. 6 electricity. 7 computers along with information. And 8 would be colonizing worlds. This little blue sphere was just now reaching level 8. This means they should be easy to defeat, relatively speaking, as you could simply bring in the massive battleships and pummel down population centers and easily take down military outposts, as you didn't even have to be that close, as any of these strike with extreme force, many of the species believed to die from simply the shockwave that comes down. Along with that, each of these battleships brings a plethora of smaller vessels that were clearly made to go into the atmosphere and land, and once they're there, they're to clean up the remnants. This was a tactic that had been used on many, many worlds. Doing this, they cause minimal damage to the planet, and they can simply clear out the infestation of what they do not want and take it over. ETA to completion, usually 0.78 of a planet's solar cycle. As the attack begins, the Dumas immediately delete all the satellites. They are actually surprised that a few satellites actually do turn and attempt to fire, but very, very few. It seems that they also receive communications from the surface. When translated, these were simply calls for peace, to work together, which were immediately denied and scoffed at. They do not need to talk to these, what are they called again? Humans? The Dumases only want them to disappear. That is their only purpose in this time. The humans actually use weapons that do reach outside of their own atmosphere. However, these prove ineffective, except for one single strike that seems to get through, mainly because most believed that they would not cause any damage. However, the significant amount of damage took many of them by surprise. Then they realized that they needed to detach the landing craft and send them soon, because if they were actually swarmed by said ordnance, well, they wouldn't be able to get their battleships even close. As the landing craft came down through, it was clear to anyone that only certain areas were able to resist. Many of the craft were targeted as soon as they entered the atmosphere. Many craft were actually in the air waiting for the Dumases to actually come through, and started to sink their landing craft even before, in some cases splashing them, making sure none survived. The Dumas watched this carefully from above, as they watched their craft be torn asunder in some places, and totally untouched in others. Those where the craft were being taken out were immediately targeted on, and they looked to see where these other craft were going to be, where the ordnance was coming from the surface, and they then targeted with orbital strikes. Still, there was a surprisingly high amount of losses, mostly in equipment, as they don't really count personnel all that much, as life is very cheap to these Dumases. Once on the ground, extermination procedures continue. Disembarking across many areas, they find that the local population is highly resistant, as in excessively so. It seems as though an incredibly high amount of ballistic weapons are coming in. Many of those on the ground don't barely even make it out of their ships before they're simply cut down by tons and tons of ballistics. They raise their energy shields, but these can only stop a few shots before they simply overload and shut down. This means that they have to charge harder and hit with even heavier weapons. They begin to use their own shuttles, their own air support, their own artillery, their own heavy weapons in the form of armored personnel carriers and such. And over time, as they push forward, using the energy shields to deflect the first or second shot, the resistance becomes less and less over time. Yet the locals continue to resist. Even as they seem to run out of ballistic weapons, these hairy creatures seem to jump up and seem to strike out with sharpened pieces of metal. Failing those, they would simply take the manipulators on the end of their arms, curl them up, and use them as a bludgeon, sometimes opening them up, gripping onto the Dumas, and simply hearing a satisfying crack as they snapped the carapace and the internal structures, many times ripping parts clean off. Yet under constant, relentless assault, not only are they able to hold the lines against the Dumas, but they cannot hold the lines against the fire that comes down from the skies. Yet even through this all, the humans are seen as a potential slave class, something that the Dumas can use. These Dumases are very, very interested in a strong slave class, one that they can use to fight for them. That is, if they can finally get these humans to submit. Yet somehow, even after all their infrastructure is gone, after all their vehicles are left burning or left as nothing but slag and wrecks, even after running out of their own weapons, they continue to resist, sometimes grabbing up these Dumas' weapons and using them against them, which amazes them all, even fighting with nothing but their simple, bare manipulators and their beasts at their side, which scares even the hardest warrior. You simply hear that strange sound they make right before you find this giant furry beast on you, using its teeth to sink in and flipping left and right, up and down with such ferocity that many soldiers find themselves torn to absolute pieces. These soldiers, these marines, these forces, does not matter what you call them, they all fear this creature, and even seeing one in the distance means they are going to send all the ordnance they can to kill it. The invasion took a full planetary rotation at this point, and that was unacceptable to the high command of these Dumases. The battleships began bombarding the area still resisting and flooding the planet with forces. This defiance will not stand against them. They are the Dumas, and they will not be stopped. They will not be denied. Yet due to all this, the royalty of the Dumas had come to see why there was an issue, and what they saw actually delighted them. It seemed as they were entertained by the struggle. They watched their own on the ground, fighting so desperately, so ferociously, being torn apart by these bipeds, by these strange furry creatures, not only on 2 legs, but a 4, and they simply enjoyed the show. In many cases, they would place wagers on how many of their own would be torn apart before they were able to take out these humans. The name was looked at with disdain, but also a modicum of respect at this point. And eventually, the fighting ceased. And when the fighting ceased and the human technology had fully failed them, the royalty and the guards, denying the fact that all the military told them that it was not completely safe yet, descended towards the ground as they wanted to see these locals firsthand. Not only that, they wanted to see if they could bring some on as their servants, perhaps as some fun for them as well. The few remaining humans were brought in front of all the royalty, all the humans bloody and beaten, many of them missing small parts to them, maybe a finger, maybe a foot, it didn't matter. They were all down in chains, yet all of them seemed to have some sort of look, a look showing predatory teeth. Those in charge of subduing them looked at these creatures in chains and saw that they looked like they were growling and would strike the humans, yet it seems with every strike that smile just got bigger and bigger, and so did the eyes, even those that seemed to be swollen, almost shut. That is when many realized that these bloody faces, these bodies still dripping what little blood was left in their faces, well, they were attached to a smile of delight, and they wanted to know why. One of those that was controlling the humans raised up its staff, beat one down, stabbed it right through the heart, and as the blood exited the body and gone into the sand. It looked to another, raised the head forward, and started to demand, "Why? Why are you so delighted?" That human stood up in defiance and looked the nobility right in the eye, and just as the ground started to rumble ever so slightly, it began yelling, "You have spilled too much! You have spilled just enough! You have spilled enough for the tree of liberty to grow strong for sure! You have spilled enough for the fires of justice! You have spilled more than enough! You have spilled, sacrificed enough damn souls! You have spilled and slaughtered more than enough of the innocent," and as they say this, the rumbling among the ground continues to rattle and shake. "You have no idea what you have unleashed." At this point, the ground is shaking violently, so much so that many cannot stay on their feet. Then there's suddenly a massive boom coming from the sky that seems to rip like thunder across the sky, but so loud that it rips through the area, shaking the buildings even harder, almost as though it's a shockwave. Many of the glass windows simply explode. Right as subordinates come running in from one side, and as the door swings open, light pierces through, brighter than the sun, forcing many of them to cover their faces, putting both hands over the eyes to the point that they can see through their manipulators, turning away as the brightness just seems to burn them. On the other side of this same building, another subordinate comes crashing in, screaming that they need to tell the nobility something. As they do, a dark red light comes forth through the doorway, and as the subordinate rushes in, the heat wave comes through, making them all wince in pain as anything turned that way is simply scalding hot. One of the subordinates yells that the sky is breaking. "It looks like a dimensional rift of some sort. We don't know what's going on." The other, screaming at the same time, "The ground is breaking apart. It's as though something is breaking through the planet and coming up." As the nobility finally get a hold of themselves and look around along with the military personnel, from the light of the sky, masses of shining beings come out, flooding the area and descending towards the ground. And from the ground, giant fissures open up as fire seems to belch out, along with magma, and grotesque creatures begin to crawl their way to the surface. While this is happening, the humans laugh with glee. The distorted smile, and the eyes are enough to make the strongest heart shiver, especially with the sound of them cackling to the sky. The beings from the sky continue to descend at amazing speed and stop just above the surface, maybe 5 or 6 meters. The creatures that have come from the ground simply stop and look up. And both sides simply seem to be looking at each other. They pause, staring so intently that it's almost as though they're speaking, but no words are heard. Nothing from the translators. Everyone just looks. Then suddenly, both those that came from the heavens and those that came from below turn towards the invaders. It is at this moment the invading species knew they had fucked up. The angels began to fly up high, striking anything in the sky, ripping it to pieces, reaching right in through the hull, ripping it open, grabbing those inside and throwing them to the ground, hearing them scream as they fall down. Those that fought back found spears, swords, bows of different type, lanced right through them as they screeched in pain. It left absolutely no scar, but they absolutely were in agony at this. Then they flew up even higher as the battleships, the destroyers, and everything else tried to make a run for it. They exited the atmosphere, found these battleships. Even though the shields were up, they simply went through. These huge, wide appendages on both sides seemed to move fluently as though flying through the air, allowing them to push right through the shields, right through the hull, and grabbing all of those inside and tearing them apart. mainly by tearing their heart out and showing it to the one in front of them, letting them watch it beat a few times before the eyes simply rolled back in the head. Those that were still on the ground, those that came from underneath, rushed across the land and began to dismember all. They didn't just dismember either. They didn't make it quick by ripping off the head. No, they would simply cackle and laugh as they grabbed a hold of the appendages, ripping them off, some of them grabbing them down, flipping them over and doing nasty, nasty things to them as those on the ground screeched in pain as though they were being skewered by something of over 6,000 degrees. Sometimes from multiple angles. The screams of absolute terror were soon covered by screams of agony as these creatures from the ground ran through, seemingly have to rip open everything with their own claws, fly up as little bit as they can, pounce down, and start tearing everything apart. They carried very few weapons as they seemed to be outfitted with their own. The invaders tried to leave as best they could, yet they could not. As soon as they tried to move their ships, they were suddenly overrun. Those on the ground tried to leave and then found themselves being completely overrun by these creatures. Even though they don't seem that heavy, it seemed as though they were simply pulling them back down, even to the point of having giant chains burst from the ground, wrap around the ships, and pull them straight down, not stopping at the surface, but dragging them down below. No one got far at all. Even the ships outside the atmosphere seemed to be pulled towards the planet, as some sort of light seemed to appear around them and either grab them and throw them towards the planet, or simply push them right into the gravity well. Any of those that got close were immediately wrapped up in chains and dragged down. The survivors of those that crashed desperately tried to resist, but it was worthless. At that point, a year of hell began as these creatures went across the skies, went across the land, and through the oceans. Many of those that had come to slaughter everyone from Earth found themselves being dragged into a secondary area by those that were on the ground, screaming for any type of assistance from those that stayed up in the sky, yet those in the sky simply sat and watched as these invaders were pulled into these secondary areas and the torture truly began. Many, seeing this happen, opted to end themselves before anything happened. Others sat there, dropped to their knees, and begged for forgiveness. Those that did this in front of the nobility quickly found the nobility were not going to have this, as their pride was on the line. They would either use their scepters to lance through their guards, or pick up a weapon and end them with some sort of energy or projectile weapon. It didn't matter, as their pride was on the line, and they would not forsake their pride until Pride himself arrived. Pride himself walked forward as many of those creatures held the nobility down. Pride himself would decide what to do with them. And Pride, he had some ideas. And as this year of hell reached across the planet, only those in the invading force that were the absolute most rigid devout were spared. Only them. Only a rare few, most of which were so young and so new to this that they had not got any blood on their hands just yet. Many of them had been conscripted, and they had simply dropped down and said, if you're going to do something, just do it fast. Seeing that they were spared, they believed that at least this was only going to be happening on this one ball spinning through space. Yet, what they did not know is that across the universe, these same beings and creatures started coming out of those planets, coming out of their skies, and destroying all they had deemed guilty. In their final moments, many of these species realized why the humans tried so hard to resist, tried so hard to keep the blood off the ground. As it turns out, when technology fails for the humans, what will arise are things that even the greatest technology cannot stop. For a time, the only thing heard on any planet, even through the void of space, was the screams of despair, of fear, of pain, all of which eventually faded after a very short time compared to the age of the universe. Once vengeance, justice, and wrath were satisfied, those that had come from below returned below, and those that came from above returned from above. And now, across all the universe, there is only one sound to be heard: silence. Hello everybody, this is Syntax. I hope you enjoyed today's story as we see what happens when technology fails. Before I go, I need to send out some special thank yous to a few of my supporters, and those would be Erica Gem, Guardian Sage, Brian Kemp, Sir, Cause Lynn, Chris Dixon, and SS Demon. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel. Everybody else, I will see you on the next one. This is Syntax, punching out.